It is Miss Brett here, and today I have the honor of taking y'all through our last writing skill that we need to learn. So far, we've covered short answer questions, we've covered the long essay question, and today we are covering the document based question, which we call a DBQ. Now, the DBQ, in my opinion, is the easiest part of the AP test because it's going to give you documents that are going to help refresh your memory. It's going to help you recall information. And ultimately, the entire essay is about you discussing the documents, not really about your historical knowledge. So you're given the gift of documents to help you formulate an essay and discuss these documents. So today I'm going to take you through the elements of a DBQ, kind of show you some examples, and we are going to practice together building a DBQ and how to incorporate all the elements required for a DBQ. Now, to calm you a little bit, there's some good news because we've already covered so many of the skills required for the DBQ. We just have to change up something real easy to make sure we hit all the points. So let's talk about what goes into a DBQ or what you're given with a DBQ. Well, for one, you are going to be given 7 documents. And with those 7 documents, you have to use 6. So there's usually an extra document that you can just throw out. And when you're analyzing your documents, if you find yourself struggling to understand what a document's saying, move on to the next one. You don't have to use all of them. You just have to use 6. With the documents, what you're trying to do when you are analyzing them is you are trying to basically figure out how you can group similar documents together. Like find a commonality that 2 documents have, and that becomes a subpoint. So you're having to analyze your documents before you know what your subpoints are going to be. You want to think about which documents have something in common so that can then become a subpoint for your thesis. So if you had 2 documents about Native Americans, or if you have 2 documents that have something to do with taxes, or if you have 2 documents about foreign policy, something that you can draw a connection and that become the subpoint that you will then write that paragraph about. So this is a skill that we're going to practice. We're going to definitely try to use and really practice this because this is one of the hardest parts of the essay is taking your documents and finding categories, 3 specific categories to make your subpoints and develop your paragraphs. Once you have your categories, then all you're doing is talking about the documents. So in the DBQ, the traditional DBQ, you are given 1 hour to write the essay. And College Board basically recommends that you spend 15 minutes planning. We talk about how important it is to brainstorm, to think, to plan, so that you set yourself up to write a successful essay. So 15 minutes to go through the documents, figure out your categories, figure out which 3 topics you're going to fit your documents into, and then you start writing and you have 45 minutes to write the essay. So with that being said, the DBQ is the heaviest weighted question on the AP test. Remember, we are prepping y'all to take the traditional AP test. I know last year there were exceptions. We are not banking on having these exceptions this year. College Board has said that we are going back to normal. And so with the DBQ, this is the heaviest weighted question. It's the most important part of the essay or about the AP test and about your score. But the fact that they're giving you the gift of documents, you don't have to have too much prior knowledge and historical knowledge to do well. And we're going to take you by point by point. So the DBQ, what is in a DBQ essay? What do you have to incorporate to knock out all the points of the rubric? Well, one, you have to do an introduction. We already know how to do that. Secondly, you have to bring in only 1 piece of outside evidence, and we're going to talk about what outside evidence means. But in the end, you're only responsible for bringing in 1 piece, just 1 piece of historical knowledge you know. And then your 3 body paragraphs will be document-based body paragraphs. And we're going to talk about how you simply just switch using CLTs to using documents. So in the DBQ essay, the document-based question essay, these are the elements you have to successfully master the rubric. So the introduction, we already know how to do this. The introduction is exactly the same as the long essay question that we've been doing for Unit 4A and for Unit 3. You have your context where you're having to connect the topic of the prompt to a broader historical event. And you're having to make that broader historical event relevant to the topic of the prompt. Okay, it can happen before or during the time frame of the question, but having to make it relevant. How is that CLT that you're telling me about relevant to our prompt? And then you need to do your thesis, and the thesis is exactly the same as well, where you have X, however, A plus B, therefore Y. And the DBQ questions are exactly the same. It could be analyze the causes. It could be compare 2 different topics. It could be analyzing continuity and changes. They're the exact same style questions, but now we're just incorporating documents instead of tons of CLTs. So the intro is exactly the same. We're already set up to be successful because we've been writing intro paragraphs for a while now. All right. So where things are a little different is you need one piece of outside evidence anywhere in the essay. It can go anywhere. Now, I have students who, they get to the end of the essay and they realize, oh my gosh, I totally forgot to bring in a piece of outside evidence. It's okay. Make it its own little paragraph at the end of the essay. I have some students who they just do this right after their thesis. They make their own little paragraph just so they don't forget about it. But if it fits in one of your categories, one of your subpoints, you can throw it into one of your body paragraphs. This can go anywhere in the essay. It only has to be one piece of evidence, and don't forget about it. A lot of students, they're getting so caught up in the documents, they forget to bring in a piece of outside evidence. So what is outside evidence? Well, it's a capital letter term, but it cannot be in any of the documents, and it cannot be your contextualization. So you need to make sure you look and read through all of your documents, look at the source, make sure you're picking a term that is not anywhere given to you, and it cannot be your context. So outside evidence, it's very important to look at your sources. Like if you have a speech by George Washington, you cannot use Washington as a CLT if they give it to you. It has to be something that you're bringing to the table that you know of historical evidence that helps your essay. So you are doing the same thing you normally do in an essay with outside evidence with CLTs. You're defining it. You have to make sure you define it. And then you have to make sure and tell me why the CLT helps your argument. Don't just pick some random term and then you can't even tell me how this is explaining your argument. You want to be strategic. You want to pick something that's relevant to the prompt, that you can fully explain how your CLT shows continuity or change, helps prove similarity or difference, or helps prove cause or effect. So making sure you pick a term that you can heavily explain and connect. So with your outside evidence, it's just one, but you want to thoroughly define it and explain it so that you can get that point. Okay? And again, it can go anywhere in the essay. If you want to write your intro and then have another paragraph for your outside evidence and then have your body paragraphs, or if you want to write your intro and then have your body paragraphs, and somewhere in your body paragraphs, you put one piece of outside evidence. Okay? I always encourage students, especially for the DBQ, to underline, to bold, to really emphasize, like point it out as outside evidence. Okay? All right, now let's get to the bulk of the essay, which is your document-based body paragraphs. These are your body paragraphs based off of your X, your A, and your B subpoints from your thesis. So just like a normal body paragraph, you need to have a topic sentence. Which subpoint are you writing about in this paragraph? Is this paragraph your economic, your social, your political? What's the paragraph about? And what's the assertion? So it could be, that the era of good feelings saw change in foreign policy, or it could be that there were economic reasons for Declaration of Independence. Whatever the prompt is asking, you're having to take which subpoint are you writing and what is the argument, okay? Comparison, continuity and change, or cause effect. So that's all the same. Here's where things change. You are bringing in 2 documents instead of 2 CLTs. So you're not having to rely on your historical knowledge of the topic. You're having to rely on your understanding of the documents. So in a body paragraph, we've always told you to bring in 2 CLTs. Now in a DBQ, you're bringing in 2 documents, okay? That's why it's so important to take the time to plan and make sure that you're planning which documents can group together to be one subpoint, to be one body paragraph. So how do you analyze a document thoroughly? Well, first things first is you want to announce the document, announce the main idea or the topic of the document. You are not quoting the document, but you're announcing it. And a lot of times I always say, look at the source. Sometimes the source helps you to announce, hey, I'm about to talk about this document. So if it was like Washington's farewell address, you can simply announce it by saying, at the end of Washington's presidency, he gave a farewell address. It's just an announcement, an assertion of, hey, this is the document I'm about to discuss and analyze. Then you give your proof, and how you analyze a document is with a HIP statement. So remember HIP, and we're going to practice HIP. You are picking one of the HIP acronym. You are not doing all 4 HIP. You are just doing one. So you could do the historical context of the document. You could do the intended audience of the document. You could do the purpose, or you could do the point of view. And there are plenty of times where the documents really lend themselves to which one of the HIP elements to do. Like if you have a chart of data, if you saw immigration, right? High rises of immigration throughout the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, and you saw this influx of immigrants. Well, a chart doesn't have a point of view. There's no bias in data, right? So in a chart, you have to ask yourself, why is immigration rising? And so many times with data, charts, historical context is the obvious, right? And the context for why are immigrants coming into the United States in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s is the market revolution. So your HIP statement would be the context saying that immigration rose throughout this period because of the market revolution, which created more jobs in industrializing cities, right? It's the context. Sometimes, though, we get speeches. Like presidential speeches are always very purposeful, right? Presidents give speeches to bring in a purpose. They are pushing something. They are trying to persuade people. They're trying to inform people. They're trying to correct something. Presidential speeches or speeches in general tend to always lean themselves to purpose, really promoting what they're trying to do, okay? Where other things, like in my opinion, political cartoons are super biased. And we're about to get into, we've seen some political cartoons like the Embargo Act with the turtle, where we're seeing that political cartoons, without a doubt, have a point of view. they are critiquing something. They are either trying to make something look good or trying to make something look bad. And anytime you do point of view, if you just say the word believed, right? Belief is your point of view. So if you say the illustrator believed that Thomas Jefferson's Embargo Act was harmful to the economy, right? You're emphasizing what is that illustrator's point of view. So data really lends itself to context, speeches, and just kind of announcements and things like that tend to lean themselves to purpose. Cartoons really emphasize point of view. And then intended audience, in my opinion, tends to be one of those that is just, it can be a little damaging because sometimes the intended audience is not very clear. And you never want to say the intended audience is Americans. This is US history, right? So sometimes intended audience is not super obvious. And so I always try and push students to think about context, purpose, point of view, because those three things tend to be very obvious depending on the type of document we're analyzing. So in a HIP statement, when you write the statement, like the illustrator believed blah, 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 or George Washington was trying to persuade people to blah, 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 whatever your HIP statement is, at the end of the sentence, you have to give citation. You need to put parentheses and which document you are referring to, and then a period. So your HIP statement, this is the bulk of the essay, is analyzing the documents properly. You're never going to quote the document, okay? That is not a HIP statement. Don't ever quote. That is a waste of time. You are simply telling me what's the context, who's the intended audience, what is the purpose, or what is the point of view. You only have to pick one for the document. Now, I have students who do the purpose for all 6 of them, and that is fine. There is nothing that says you have to do all of the elements. You could literally do purpose for all 6 and be okay. But some documents really are more obvious of which element to use. And then your analysis. You have to explain how the HIP statement proves your assertion. How is this HIP statement showing continuity? How is this HIP statement showing change? Or how is this HIP statement showing similarities or differences or causes and effects? You have to explain how the document's context, audience, purpose, or point of view is relevant to your argument. And this is difficult. We're going to practice this, okay? So you are doing APE twice in a body paragraph for 2 documents, okay? You don't need to bring in outside evidence. All you need to do is focus on announcing the document, giving your HIP statement with the citation, and then linking that HIP statement to your thesis. And that's a DBQ. So just to kind of go back before we look at practice, you have your intro, context, and your thesis. 1 piece of outside evidence that's a term nowhere to be found in your documents, and then 3 DBQ paragraphs where you're analyzing, you are aping each document in your body paragraphs. So let's look at some practice before we practice together. So here's our prompt. Analyze the reasons the American colonists declared independence from Great Britain. Okay, so I just have 2 documents up here. Remember, you're given 7 and you have to use 6. So I'm kind of leading you to know which, like, a category that we can kind of bring together and connect it to causes of the American Revolution. So document A, resolutions of the Stamp Act Congress. So if we can already remember what the Stamp Act was, that helps us with context, right? That helps us with understanding that the Stamp Act Congress was trying to repeal the Stamp Act. So when we read this, it is inseparably essential to the freedom of a people and the undoubted right of Englishmen that no taxes be imposed on them, but with their own consent or by their representatives. That it is indispensable duty of these colonies to the best of sovereigns to procure the repeal of the act for granting and applying certain stamp duties of all clauses of any other acts of Parliament for the restriction of American commerce. So this document kind of has two emphasizes. It's basically saying Britain cannot tax the colonies without representation, and that these taxes are basically preventing commerce. They are becoming a burden, that this tax is a restriction on the American economy. Okay, so we're kind of seeing a political note and an economic note. Then we have document B, David Ramsay, The History of the American Revolution, 1789. So this is post-revolution. So Mr. Charles Townshend, that name should ring a bell, Townshend. Afterwards, Chancellor of the Exchequer, pawned his credit to accomplish what many so earnestly desired. He accordingly brought into Parliament a bill for granting duties in the British colonies on glass, paper, painter's color, and tea, which was afterwards enacted into law. So that's the definition of the Townshend Act. If the small duties imposed on these articles had preceded the Stamp Act, they might have passed unobserved. But the late recent discussions occasioned by that act had produced among the colonists not only an animated conviction of their exemption from parliamentary taxation, but a jealousy suspicion of their designs of Great Britain. So this is saying that the Townshend Act, is going to be another burden, another tax, and again, also has that government note about whether or not taxation was allowed. So both of these have something in common. They're about taxation, they're about taxes on the colonies, and they're about, representation in Parliament as well. And you could link those in any way. So if we have an introduction where we have assume we had 4 other documents to make our subpoints. But remember, an introduction is exactly the same. So kind of giving a time period before the American Revolution, define the Revolution, a period of reasoning and logical thinking spread throughout Europe and also into the Americas. And bringing in the CLT, this age of thinking is known as the Enlightenment and resulted in Enlightenment thinkers challenging authority and abusive monarchies. Due to the Enlightenment, American colonists began challenging the British Crown, leading to the American Revolution. So our thesis, the X statement, the American colonists declared independence from Great Britain due to excessive and unfair taxation. However, the primary reasons for independence were because of increased political authority from the British Crown and threats to colonial representation. Therefore, there were more political causes for independence than economic. So the intro is exactly the same. Nothing changes, but you're using your documents to drive your subpoints for your thesis. So outside evidence, remember I told you outside evidence can literally go anywhere in the essay, but it needs to be well defined and well analyzed. So remember, outside evidence can't be in the documents and it cannot be your context. So we can't use the Enlightenment. So this one is the French and Indian War. It was a major event that led colonists to declare independence. And so defining the French and Indian War from 54 to 63 over territorial expansion among the American colonists and the French. This war forced the British to protect its colonies and sent military aid to the American colonies. But then you have to tell me, well, how did the French and Indian War cause the American Revolution? After the war was over, the British were victorious and the British Crown began imposing many new policies and taxes on the American colonists. And the colonists were prevented from expanding west. They were taxed in order to pay off British debt and forced to support British troops. So the French and Indian War created all of the issues and grievances that led the colonists to declare independence. So you're not only defining the French and Indian War, you have to explain how it helps your assertion, your causes to the American Revolution. So looking at an example of a document-based body paragraph, we're going to use document A and B, the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act, to basically analyze how they were excessive taxes on the colonists. So remember, a document-based question starts, or paragraph starts, with a topic sentence. What's the subpoint? And assert the causation. Excessive taxation was one economic reason the American colonists declared independence from Great Britain. So we know the subpoint is excessive taxation, and we know the assertion is that it was a reason, it was a cause. So let's announce the document, which was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was a law imposed by Parliament that forced colonists to pay a tax on all paper goods and documents. So even like just a definition of the Stamp Act, something that tells me you're going to analyze this document. The resolutions of the Stamp Act Congress know that the HIP statement did not start with document A, use the source. Okay, it sounds so much more collegiate to use the source instead of saying in document A, just say the source. The resolutions of the Stamp Act Congress was attempting to persuade the British Crown to repeal the tax on the American colonists. So think about which HIP element is that. Okay, if they are trying to persuade someone to do something, that's purpose, right? This document had the purpose to get the British Crown to repeal the tax. But now we have to analyze how that statement, persuading the British Crown to repeal the tax, how did that cause the American Revolution? Well, the American colonists felt that the Stamp Act was an unfair economic burden placed on the colonists. Because the Stamp Act Congress believed the tax was unfair, it led colonists' frustrations toward the British to grow and eventually led to the Declaration of Independence. So we're connecting how the Stamp Act Congress, that purpose of it, pushed colonists to also feel the desire to then lead to the Declaration of Independence. So now we ape the second document. And again, we announce it. The Townshend Acts were laws also imposed by Parliament on the colonists that taxed many goods like tea, glass, and lead. So again, this is basically like a definition of this, what this was. So David Ramsay, remember, referred to the source, viewed the Townshend Act as an unfair law because he believed that colonists were exempt from taxes of Parliament since colonists were not represented in Parliament. So those words, viewed, he believed. This is obviously point of view. And notice citation, document B. Because of this unfair and excessive taxation, many colonists grew frustrated with Britain and began to have similar viewpoints to Ramsay, which resulted in the colonists declaring independence. We are linking his viewpoints to causing Declaration of Independence. So then, just to summarize, it is clear that through the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act, Great Britain was excessively taxing American colonists. However, American colonists felt this taxation was unfair and abusive. These taxes ultimately led to the American colonists declaring independence from Great Britain. So in a document-based question, you are not analyzing CLTs, you are analyzing documents. And so with a document-based question, essay, we already know how to do the intro, we already understand contextualization and a thesis, but now instead of analyzing CLTs, we are analyzing documents. And so we're going to practice taking 6 documents, how to create categories from them, and then practice hipping our documents that we can make sure the HIP element is really strong for that specific document. So this is the skill we are focusing on for the next couple units, and it's one, again, that I really emphasize. The DBQ is your friend. You have all these documents given to you. You need very little historical knowledge, and you are really taking these documents and putting them into organization and explaining how they cause something, how there's similarity and differences, or how there's continuity and change. All right, ask questions, of course, if you have them.